Well, in our Torah portion for this week, for next week, we face one of the Bible's knottiest problems, a problem not only ancient but also modern, as I hope to show you. And it's the problem of hardening of Pharaoh's heart. God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And here's a quote from the book of Exodus, second book of the Bible, chapter 7. God speaks to Moses here. You and your brother Aaron shall speak to Pharaoh to let the Israelites depart from his land, but I, God, will harden Pharaoh's heart, that I might multiply my signs and my marvels in the land of Egypt, end quote. In other words, Pharaoh's obstinate and persistent resistance to Moses' demands actually appears to be attributed to divine causality. And this, of course, raises the issue of free will. How, for example, can we blame someone who is not the cause of his or her own action? Is this what the Bible really means to teach us? That we can blame or punish someone who is not the cause of his or her own action. What does this say about the Bible's view of God? Does God come down and maybe to some degree gratuitously to lead a person to destruction? So in order to try to untangle this web, we have to look carefully at what the Bible is telling us about these matters. As it turns out, the book of Exodus has 20 expressions of the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. And these are divided into two even categories. 10 times where Pharaoh himself initiates the action, and 10 times when God initiates the action. And although the very first of these 20 expressions of hardening of the heart is articulated by God, it is not until the 6th plague, the second half of the 10 plagues, that God actually intervenes. The first 5 plagues show us that it is Pharaoh's own obduracy that causes the plagues. So the text stamps in those first 5 plague narratives, stamps the Pharaoh himself as a callous, evil-minded person who must bear the responsibility for his own actions. The king himself, in other words, is guilty and not a blameless individual whose integrity is compromised by divine intervention. So what do we have here, given these 2 parts of the whole of the plague narratives? We can see it, first of all, in theological terms. At first, the king himself is guilty and thereby creates his own problems. Then, and only then, does God intervene. Human action, then divine action. Or we can see the matter psychologically. The second way, this psychological approach points to Pharaoh for both of these halves of the story. At first, Pharaoh is consciously wicked, consciously malevolent, the cause of his actions. But then the succession of actions, one after another, and this I think is the crucial point, leads to the creation of a habit of habitual and habituated behavior. In this sense, it is not God who comes to harden Pharaoh's heart, but Pharaoh himself, through habituated action, is the cause of the second half of the story, but now not fully consciously, but as a result of his accustomed behavior. So that from this perspective, when the Torah says that God comes to actively harden Pharaoh's heart, this is just a theological way of saying that Pharaoh has, to some significant degree, lost control of his choices and chooses, in quotes, out of habit. The Pharaoh, in other words, has developed an obvious and willing predisposition. Notice the prefix pre, before an action. Something has already taken place. Now it's not just Pharaoh's actions, but Pharaoh's condition, the platform in his soul that causes the action, a state of being. In other words, Pharaoh here has become a prisoner of his own irrationality, and therefore still has to be punished for what he has done and for what he continues to do. From this psychological perspective, to say that God hardens Pharaoh's heart is just a way of saying that in some important sense, Pharaoh, though still responsible, has lost control. This is close to the position of Maimonides, who says that Pharaoh deserves to be punished because it is he and only he who did it. And when Maimonides says that God at one point withheld free will from Pharaoh, what he might very well have meant was that Pharaoh restricted his own free will by succumbing to habituated behavior, which is a form of the restriction of our free will. And this position is also close to Erich Fromm's view that Pharaoh's heart hardens because he keeps on doing evil. Namely, it hardens to the point where no more change or repentance is possible. So this raises the very interesting question of the role of habit in our lives. We can create good habits or we can create bad habits. Good habits are the glue of our relationships with one another, the glue of the well-functioning social order. Please and thank you, manners, writing thank you notes, gratitude, leaning toward optimism as a fundamental attitude, the cultivation of courage between the extremes of cowardice and recklessness, in the family, clearing the table after dinner, doing the family chores, putting coins in the tzedakah box, as a matter of habit, as a matter of predisposition, as a matter of doing what has become natural. I shouldn't have to think every time a situation arises whether I'm going to do the right thing. I should have cultivated habits. And if I don't, the social process, the family process will not work. Doing them instinctively or learning instincts, if you'll pardon the paradox, is what is crucial. And habits arise from doing things over and over again. I create habits, dispositions, to say please and thank you, to be polite to everyone, to love my neighbor even if I don't like my neighbor. This comes only through a series of actions. Actions create habits, which in turn create actions. That is through the cultivation of good behavior. I cultivate the virtues of courage, of moderation, of insight, of concern, of justice, of gratitude, of benevolence. But of course, I also can create bad habits. I can create the habit of being self-centered and to eschew the notion of gratitude. I can create a sour pessimism that sees only the dark side and darkens the lives of those with whom I come in contact. I can create a disinclination to help the family thrive. I can lean toward malevolence. Namely, the story of the hardening of the heart can reveal the problems and the possibilities of developing habits, and how we must take care to create in ourselves good, positive, socially productive habits. But habits, nevertheless. And let's call these habits virtues. It seems to me is one of the educational imperatives that faces parents and grandparents and teachers and rabbis and cantors. Because good habits create flourishing societies with norms that don't have to be articulated in law or determined by courts. Good habits bind us together. Bad habits corrode the social order, introducing chaos into communal life. And one of the lessons of our Torah portion, if you'll allow me, is to tell us about the need for education, for socialization, the right kind of socialization, and to do it early and to do it often before, by choice or by habit, bad dispositions are cultivated. I recall, maybe some of you do as well, the comedian Flip Wilson, who said on several occasions in his act, "The devil made me do it." Yep, there might be forces out there that have an impact on our behavior. But ultimately, if our hearts are hardened, it is we and not God who harden them. And if our hearts are softened, receptive, generous, loving, then it is we who soften them through habituated thought, action, and passion. It is we who make our hearts responsive and responsible and caring.